Hey everyone, I'm back with more Genshin Impact, as usual. Now you might be wondering, Zoob, do you even have an update schedule? To which I answer, yes, I do have an update schedule, that I blatantly ignore for my own convenience. Also yes, the Dino Blob has been updated. As per usual, if you don't like math, you could just skip right to the conclusion in the description below. Today's topic was, who's the best Geo support for Ningguang? But after doing some math, it ended up as more of a, how do I build Ningguang and who happens to be the best Geo support for Ningguang? In case you don't know, there's going to be some serious Geo resonance changes when 1.3 is released. Among these changes, whenever your active character is shielded, all damage dealt will be increased by 15%, and dealing damage to enemies will decrease their Geo resistance by 20% for 15 seconds. Effectively, Ningguang will be doing around a multiplicative 38% damage, assuming the damage dealt increase isn't part of elemental damage bonuses. Of course, in order to realistically determine who would be the best support for Ningguang, I decided that I needed to know what was best for her. Ningguang is a relatively complex character, but that's to be expected for a Catalyst DPS character. And as a Catalyst user, there are a great many weapons with incredible effects and secondary stats. But let me be blunt here, there are almost no good free-to-play weapons for Catalyst users, especially for Ningguang. The three free options we have are the Mappa Mare, Prototype Amber, and Frostbearer. The issue with these weapons, at least for Ningguang, is that Mappa Mare's secondary stat is Elemental Mastery, which is pretty much useless for a Geo carry as it only increases the strength of crystallized shields. Prototype Amber has HP % as a secondary stat, which, while it does make Ningguang slightly more tanky, it also only increases the HP of our skill, and in a game like Genshin where everything is DPS, you don't really need more HP if you have healers. Finally, Frostbearer, while it's actually a very solid weapon for a free weapon, its passive only deals 80% AoE physical damage every 10 seconds, it's also locked behind Dragonspine Exploration, and it's probably better suited for a Cryo Catalyst user whenever such a character gets released. So you shouldn't really be using Frostbearer on Ningguang if a Cryo Catalyst character also exists, because on a Cryo Catalyst user, you're dealing 200% AoE physical damage every 10 seconds. Now that isn't to say that any of these catalysts are bad. They're just relatively bad when compared to some of the 4-star gacha catalysts, which are incredibly good. If you have no gacha 4-star catalyst though, I would recommend Frostbearer, and even if you do have some gacha 4-star catalyst, I would still use Frostbearer because its raw stats are incredibly good. It's just that the passive is completely useless for Ningguang. You do like an extra 1,000 to 2,000 damage every 10 seconds. It's incredibly weak. If you're running a support Ningguang though, I'd recommend Prototype Amber since its passive heals and generates energy for all party members. But I'm looking at DPS Ningguang, so let's go through the top tier weapons that many people seem to recommend. One weapon I hear a lot of people espouse praise for is the Solar Pearl. Immediately, this weapon is better than the Forge weapons simply because its substat is crit rate. It also has the nice passive of pretty much granting you a permanent 20% boost to all normal attacks, skills, and bursts. If we look at the math for Ningguang at level 90 with a level 90 Solar Pearl, her normal attacks will do 1,801.95 damage, her charge attacks with 2 Star Jades will do 7,326.39 damage, her skill deals 7,829.92 damage, and her burst deals 28,066.14 damage. For the purposes of this video, I've switched over to actual damage calculation instead of damage % per second because several weapons have attack % as a secondary stat, as well as having variable flat attack stats. Also, I calculated in 2 Star Jades for our charge attacks because the most efficient attack cycle for Ningguang is 2 normal attacks followed by a charge attack. If you think doing 1 normal attack followed by 1 charge attack is better, that doesn't work because the time it takes to form a Star Jade is too long and doing the charge attack will still consume your stamina. Now back to Solar Pearl. There are 2 glaring issues with it. First, it doesn't increase her charge attack damage, which is a massive part of Ningguang's damage. 1 charge attack does 3 times the damage of a normal attack, and with her passive 1 backup plan, her charged attacks require 0 stamina, and they do the extra damage in the form of the Star Jades. The second issue is that Solar Pearl costs us $10. There is literally no free way to get this weapon, unlike all the gacha weapons, which, while they can be rare, you can still get them. You still have a chance of getting them. So if you're free to play, just forget about this weapon. Now the second weapon I want to talk about is the Wid Sith. Now this weapon is good if you get lucky. Its passive effect grants the character one of 3 effects for 10 seconds once every 30 seconds whenever you swap to that character. The 3 effects are 60% attack, 48% elemental damage, or a flat 240 elemental mastery. When you gain the attack or elemental damage boost, this damage actually exceeds the Frostbearer damage, with the attack boost being about 16% better, while the elemental damage is only about 0.8% better. I would go over the damage that this weapon does, like the flat damage, but I'd actually have to end up doing it 3 times, so I'm not going to do that in this video. The main issues with the Widtiff is that it only works A, when you swap to that character, so it's completely useless in co-op, B, only for 10 seconds every 30, and finally C, if you get the Elemental Mastery buff, you don't gain any additional damage, and you have to wait an additional 30 seconds to try to get a better buff. I could keep going with all the other 4-star weapons, but that would cause this video to drag on unnecessarily long, so I'm going to go through the 2 strongest 5-star catalysts for Ningguang: Skyward Atlas and Memory of Dust. Of these 2 weapons, Memory of Dust is the better, but let's go through Skyward Atlas first. Skyward Atlas has the highest attack main stat at 674, as well as 33.1 attack percent on its secondary stat when max level. Its passive gives 12% elemental damage bonus and creates a tiny bubble thing that deals 160% damage every 3 seconds for 15 seconds every 30 seconds, totaling 6 shots for 960% total damage. What's amazing about this passive is that the tiny bubble will continue to fire even if you swap characters. However, the major reason that the Skyward Atlas is such a powerful catalyst for any catalyst user is because of the sheer amount of stats it gives. It's literally just a stat stick. Looking at the math, the Skyward Atlas skyrockets Ningguang's damage. Her normal attacks now deal 2,094.05 damage, charge attacks deal 10,216.80 damage, skill deals 9,099.15 damage, and her burst deals 32,615.66 total damage. The little glowing orb of doom will tack on an additional 15,781.41 damage. This is more than 16% better than Solar Pearl, not including the floaty ball of death. But this isn't even the best weapon. Memory of Dust is better for only one reason. With only a measly 608 attack, Memory of Dust makes up for this stats by simply dumping everything into attack percent. Its secondary stat, like the Skyward Atlas, is also attack percent, but at level 90, Memory of Dust has 49.6 attack percent. Its passive effect grants up to 20 attack percent, but when your character is protected by a shield, that attack percent bonus doubles. So for someone like Ningguang, you effectively have a total extra 89.6% bonus attack. For any other Catalyst user, this weapon is pretty weak. Requiring a shield just to get a bonus like that is difficult when there's only 5 shield units in the game. But Ningguang is Geo. As a Geo Catalyst character, Ningguang creates shields whenever she hits an elementally affected enemy, and they're kind of everywhere, and that's assuming you have a team that's not just Ningguang, right? For all intents and purposes, therefore, Ningguang has a 100% shield uptime. As a result, Memory of Dust becomes her best in slot weapon. Her normal attacks now do 2,390.30 damage, charge attacks do 11,662.2 damage, skill does 10,386.43 damage, and her burst deals 37,229.88 damage, which is a 14% increase over Skyward Atlas and a 32.65% increase over Solar Pearl. This 14% difference is more than enough to outdo even Skyward Atlas's Bubble Buddy attack. I do, however, want to point out that if you're in co-op and have a crit damage headpiece, Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds actually outdamages every weapon, because without the need to switch off of Ningguang, you can easily build up stacks for Lost Prayer that you normally wouldn't be able to. But enough about weapons. Now we move on to artifacts. There are 2 main ways you could potentially build Ningguang, and only one of them is right, at least in my opinion. The first way, and vastly inferior way to build Ningguang, is a 4-piece Retracing Belied set. Now, if you're wondering why this set is so bad, it's because first, its 2-piece effect only increases shield strength. In a game like Genshin, where everything is a DPS time check, having extra strength on your shield is almost entirely useless. The second problem is that its 4-piece effect increases your normal and charge attacks by 40%. Now, 40% is a lot of damage, but Ningguang's damage is pretty evenly split between her burst and normal attack rotation. To only boost her normal and charge attacks, we'll be missing out on a lot of the potential damage she could get with what I consider to be the better set, 2-piece Archaic Petra and 2-piece Gladiator's Finale. With this set, Ningguang gains 15% geo damage bonus and an extra 18% attack. Keep in mind that these 2 bonuses are additive with others of their type, but their benefits apply to all of Ningguang's damage and not just her normal and charged attacks. However, of course, Gladiator is incredibly annoying to farm, so you may have to farm for a really long time to get good pieces. With all of that out of the way, we can now focus on the supports, because the majority of Genshin requires a solid team to beat content and not just one character unless you're a tryhard and you're trying to showcase one character in particular. Given that, we're only going to look at these support characters in a support manner. I'm going to ignore their normal attack talent since you won't be using it ever. The damage from their skills and bursts will still be considered, as well as the energy particle generation and energy costs of their support burst. Also, since they are only supporting, I'm assuming that they're only at Ascension 4 because any higher is incredibly expensive, and Ascension 4 is when you unlock the final passive. The first character I'm looking at is the first character everyone gets, the Traveler. Now, you do have to get to Liyue and resonate with a Statue of the Seven, but this can occur pretty early in the game, and it's also not that difficult, really. Like, you can just walk there, and you can activate the Statue of the Seven. For the Traveler specifically, I'll be considering them at Constellation 6, because it's free to get them to that level. As long as you are high enough AR, you just get all of their constellations for free. As a Geo character, the Traveler skill, Starfell Sword, is a high damage attack that creates a lasting boulder at the point of impact. While it typically has a cooldown of 8 seconds, this value actually drops to 6 seconds when you hit Ascension 1. Given that the Traveler is at C6, at Ascension 4, Starfell Sword will be at level 9 and deals 422% damage. Except, the Traveler's Constellation 2 causes this damage to be dealt again when the boulder is destroyed, so the maximum damage this skill can do is 844% at talent level 9. The skill also creates 3 energy particles whenever it hits an enemy. So on a 6-second cooldown, you get 3 energy particles, 422% guaranteed damage with a possibility of doubling that damage. Not bad. The Traveler's Burst, Wake of Earth, causes shockwaves in a large AoE that deals geo damage. It hits 4 times in rapid succession and causes all enemies to flinch in the AoE. Again, since the Traveler is C6, the talent level is at 9. If you manage to hit an enemy with all 4 waves, you're doing an impressive 1004% damage. Its energy cost is pretty low at only 60, especially with the energy generation for the skill, so you can almost always use this burst off cooldown. But that's not all. At Constellation 1, whenever Wake of Earth is used, all party members within its AoE gain an extra 10% additive crit rate and have increased resistance to interruption. Also, at Constellation 4, for every enemy hit by Wake of Earth, the Traveler regains 5 energy up to a max of 25 energy. So your energy cost, which is at 60, now goes down to 35. You are always going to have this up. So on a tier list for best geo support to Ningguang, I'd put the Traveler at the B tier. Now, my reasoning is, while the energy generation, damage, and crit rate boost of Traveler's skill and burst are incredible, there's a couple of pitfalls here. The first problem is that enemies occasionally get stuck on top of the boulders created by the skill. Now, this can be circumvented to a certain degree by using the held version of the skill and offsetting the placement of the boulder. However, enemies that can teleport can and will teleport on top of it and make it far harder than it needs to be to kill them. You can also end up accidentally trying to climb these boulders during combat, which can end in some pretty terrible ways, especially if something large is trying to kill you, like my favorite enemy, the Electro Fatui Skirmisher. If he's rushing you with his hammer, and you're stuck climbing, you're probably going to die or take way more damage than you need to. Another of the small problems of this is that even if the enemy can't teleport, but if it's a large enemy, like a Lava Churl or a Ruin Guard, they're going to get on top of it if you try to offset it even. They'll just get on top of it because they can just walk up and down them. It gets really annoying, especially in Abyss. The second, but arguably bigger problem, is that the Traveler's skill and burst are constructs. They are geo constructs. Now, Ningguang's rock projectiles can break on these constructs, and that will noticeably drop your DPS. Every part of her kit can break on these constructs, and you don't want that. If you try to use her auto attack next to a boulder, one of them is going to get broken. One of your rocks is just going to vanish. They'll just hit the wall, the boulder, and vanish. If you try to use Ningguang's skill next to a boulder, it won't spawn at all. It'll explode and do damage to all the surrounding enemies that would be in its AoE originally, but the Jade screen itself will not spawn. Then of course her burst, when she jumps up and spins, all those rock projectiles will go flying, and if they fly into a boulder, they vanish. So if you want to use the Traveler, you can, but you have to be really careful with your positioning of the boulders and Ningguang, or else you're going to lose a lot of your DPS. But other than these few issues, the Traveler is still a decent pick. It's just not the best, most optimal choice. Next, we have Noelle, and right off the bat, I'm going to say that she is not a good support for Ningguang, but I'm still going to go over her skill and burst and my reasonings as to why. Noelle's skill, Breastplate, creates a shield that scales off Noelle's defense, and quite a bit of it too. It also heals out a set chance whenever Noelle hits with the shield up. But if you're using Ningguang as your main DPS, we have a big problem, and that problem is you don't want to spend any more time having Ningguang off-field than you have to. With Noelle's healing, it's powerful, but it's completely random and requires her to be on the field, taking up your precious DPS uptime, so Noelle doesn't even take up the slot of a healer that well. What makes this worse is the energy doesn't generate any energy at all. Even if you have C1 Noelle, her healing becomes reliable, but she still has to be on the field. All the good healers like Bennett, Barbara, Chi-Chi, they all are off-field healers. You just drop their skill that heals and you swap back out. With Noelle, if you want to use her as a healer, you're losing DPS. You will just lose DPS, and that's unfortunate. However, the shield is incredibly good. But that's all it is. It's just a shield. If you're running Noelle, all you're doing is having a shield that doesn't even have 100% uptime, and that's it. It'll grant you the Geo Resonance bonus, but with Ningguang being Geo, she has all the Crystallize. She doesn't necessarily need a 100% Geo shield up. Now, Noelle's Burst, Sweeping Time, is no better. It infuses Noelle's attacks with Geo, and it increases her attack based on her defense. Honestly speaking, this allows Noelle to have the highest attack stat in the entire game with the right gear and some food. However, as a support, a pure support to DPS Ningguang, this is entirely useless. The damage it does on initial cast is only at 224% of Noelle's attack. And remember, we don't want Noelle on the field any longer than is absolutely necessary. So as a result of this, the defense to attack bonus is completely useless for support Noelle. So, on our handy-dandy tier list, I put Noelle as a C tier support for Ningguang. She requires too much time on field that she actually takes away from the total damage she'd be doing with Ningguang. However, I believe that Noelle's survivability isn't something to be ignored. But there's a problem. If there was more defense-based content in the game, I'd put Noelle higher for that kind of content. Bosses like, and this is spoilers for anyone who hasn't finished the Leeway storyline, but bosses like pre-nerf Story Child were incredibly punishing if you misplayed. And I feel like if there was more content like that, defensive characters like Noelle would be much better. Unfortunately, they did nerf Story Child, and even level 90 Child is incredibly easy to kill. None of the bosses are actually all that hard to kill, they're just annoying to kill. So, characters like Noelle are just not needed. And I know someone's already thinking this, the whole idea of, since Noelle's a 4-star character, she's easier to get to C6, right? Yes, that's technically true, but all of her constellations are aimed at making her a better DPS, not a better support. You have things like, her burst lasts for much longer, her burst gains extra time for every enemy killed, or her shield explodes whenever it gets depleted or runs out. That last one's not that bad, but if your shield is exploding, then you're either mispositioned as Ningguang and you're in the middle of a bunch of enemies, or you just got hit by a really heavy attack causing your shield to break, and either of these two scenarios means you're playing something wrong and you're probably about to die. Now, you could also just stack a ton of defense on Noelle and make her your main DPS, and that works incredibly well, especially if you have a battery comp. But we're looking at supports, so sorry Noelle mains. Now we get to the 5-star characters. First, let's look at Zhongli. Zhongli's skill, Dominus Lapidus, creates a stone pillar when you tap and creates a shield when you hold the skill. Now the issue with Zhongli's kit is that he's still in the process of being buffed and tweaked. As of the current notes, Zhongli's held skill will create a shield, a stone pillar if the maximum number of pillars hasn't been reached, and his shield will also shred all nearby enemy resistances by 20%. Given that most enemies have 10% geo resistance, this means Zhongli will be boosting Ningguang's damage by a multiplicative 15% on average, not counting the geo resonance shred. All these are incredibly good, especially when you factor in the geo resonance that requires a shield in order to be effective. This means that you don't need Ningguang running around to collect all the crystallized shards. You can just swap to Zhongli, use his skill, get the shield, boom, 15% damage buff, right there. Plus, the additional 20% shred and 15% actual boost. However, we also have to factor in the energy generation. And for Zhongli's skill, it's pretty much 0. The actual code behind it, as far as we know, is every 2 seconds, whenever Zhongli's pillar pulses and hits an enemy, it has a 50% chance to grant a single particle. However, given the size of the AoE, the chances of Zhongli ever generating energy is incredibly low, especially if it's only every 2 seconds and if an enemy hits it. So, all the effects of his skill, incredibly good. If you want him to generate energy, don't depend on that. It will sometimes happen, but most often, it will not. Now, not only that though, Zhongli's burst, Planet Befall, deals a whopping 640% of Zhongli's attack, plus an additional 33% of his max HP on his passive too. So this burst deals a huge amount of damage, but then it also petrifies all enemies in the huge AoE for 3.6 seconds. Now, with how long it takes to swap from character to character, as long as how long it takes for Zhongli to exit his burst animation, you can lose up to a second on the petrify, but overall, he's incredibly solid as a support. So back to our tier list, I think Zhongli belongs in the S tier. The resistance shred coupled with the extreme ease of access to shields makes Zhongli a top tier geo support for Ningguang. Of course, Zhongli also creates geo constructs which can get in the way of Ningguang, but his are incredibly easy to avoid and position around because it's thin. He also only creates that one construct as opposed to the 3 that Traveler can make. Of course, there is a downside to all of this, and that is, all of this is completely subject to change. Zhongli's buffs are only scheduled to be released in 1.3, which is still about 3 weeks away, at the time of this video's creation anyways. We also don't know some of the specifics of his buffs, most specifically, how large is the debuff radius of his shield. If it's only as large as, like, a Claymore character's range, then it's not worth it to put Ningguang and Zhongli together unless you really like Ningguang dying. As it is right now on the beta servers, the debuff radius isn't that small, but it's not that large either. And neither of this really matters because all of it is subject to change. So I'm going to move on to the final Geo character, Albedo. Albedo is the last character we'll be looking at, as well as the most recent Geo character to be released. He's an incredibly versatile unit, but most importantly, he's incredibly cheap to build. Albedo's skill, Abiogenesis Solar Isotoma, creates a Solar Isotoma which creates transient blossoms whenever enemies take damage within the AoE, up to a max of once every 2 seconds. At the same time, if a character stands at the locus of the Solar Isotoma will accumulate geopower to form a crystallized platform that lifts the character up to a certain height. If any of that confused you, that's entirely okay. It's not written in a way that enables easy understanding. In easier terms, this skill just creates a flower geo construct that causes enemies to take extra AoE geo damage whenever they get hit, once every 2 seconds. If you stand on top of this construct, it will raise you upwards, hence why Albedo is known as the Elevator. Memes aside, Albedo's skill does do decent damage, with a nice 183% damage dealt on initial casting. However, the true potential of the skill comes from the transient blossom damage. Dealing 187% of Albedo's defense means he's incredibly easy to build for, and also does a lot of damage. Not only that, this damage is dealt every 2 seconds, roughly, as long as an enemy is taking damage. It's also AoE, so if another enemy is directly next to the one you're hitting, that enemy will also take the damage. With a base defense of 670 at level 70, you're looking at a bare minimum of 1,253 damage per proc. With how easy it is to stack defense though on artifacts, you can really easily hit about 1,700 defense with minimal investments. Add in a Geo Gauntlet and you're hitting almost 5,000 damage per proc without criticals. Not only that, with a duration of 30 seconds but a cooldown of only 4 seconds, this skill has a 100% uptime guaranteed against all enemies except bosses, because bosses hate Geo Constructs. This effectively amounts to a flat DPS boost to Ningguang permanently. And I almost forgot to mention, this Geo Construct is flat, so Ningguang's projectiles will never be broken by this construct as opposed to Zhongli or the Traveler. Now for Albedo's burst, Rite of Progenitor, Tectonic Tide, this burst deals 514% of Albedo's attack in a cone in front of him, and if he's in the AoE of his skill, 7 additional Geo Explosions will occur, dealing 100.8% of his attack each. These explosions will each individually target one enemy within the AoE of the skill unless there's no other unexploded enemy, in which case the explosion will just appear somewhere randomly within the AoE of the skill. If there are 7 enemies all grouped up with each other, this burst will deal upwards of 1,219.6% of Albedo's attack. If you have something like Venti's burst open right there, you're going to hit all enemies with 1,219.6% of Albedo's attack. However, if you're playing solo, it's probably not a good idea to run both an Anemo and Geo character in the same team if they're both supports, so keep that in mind. So, for our placement of Albedo on the tier list, I believe that Albedo belongs in the upper A tier. Now, all the Albedo sims who may be suffering from buyer's regret, don't worry, there's still hope. The main reason I put Albedo in A tier is because he has multiple ability dependency, or MAD. His skill uses defense for the majority of its damage, while his burst uses attack, unless you have C2 Albedo, but I'm not assuming anyone has that. It's impossible to have a high attack stat and a high defense stat while still maintaining decent crit stats. Not only that, his passive 2 is pretty much useless for Ningguang. Every time Albedo uses his burst, every party member gains 125 additive elemental mastery. As I stated earlier though, Ningguang doesn't use elemental mastery except for stronger crystallize, which is nice, but absolutely not necessary. But some people might be saying, you could stand on top of his skill platform and just shoot enemies, right? So it's safe. Well, you can, sort of. What actually happens is that Ningguang will miss her shots. A lot. Anyone with Albedo in Ningguang can tell you this. Her charge attack's turn angle is really large. It draws these massive arcs when turning, and that actually causes Ningguang to miss any enemies that happens to be too close to the platform and is moving. And this distance is about the distance from the platform to the edge of the AoE. It's incredibly disappointing, and when I first got Albedo, I was like, this is going to be the greatest synergy in the world. It was not the greatest synergy in the world. It was good synergy, but if you stand on that platform, you can only use normal attacks, and you can't use your charge attack because the charge attack will miss. Especially since most enemies will walk right up to the pillar, like the flower point, and you will barely hit anything, ever. I feel like it was just a lost opportunity. Oh, and one final point involving Albedo. If you have a skill up on the ground, and the enemy you're fighting doesn't take any damage, the skill won't proc. If you're fighting an enemy that has a shield, Albedo's skill will not activate. So this is particularly annoying if you're fighting something like an Abyss Mage or even just a common shield Hilichurl. If you're hitting them, but they're blocking it or not taking any actual damage, you don't see the white number float up, they are not going to get hit by the Geo damage explosion from Albedo's skill. Now, there is still one thing that I personally would think puts Albedo into the S tier, and I stated it earlier, and that is his cheapness. Albedo's best in slot weapon is the Harbinger of Dawn. Now, you may be wondering why this 3-star weapon is his best in slot. This is because this weapon has crit damage as its passive, but its true power lies in its passive, which grants up to 28% crit rate if the character remains above 90% of their maximum HP. And since we're not building Albedo for attack, it doesn't matter that this weapon is a 3-star weapon, because you don't need the base attack boost. On top of that, since Albedo is a turret-type character, he's never actually on the field for long enough to go below 90% HP, so he gets that constant additional 28% crit rate. With this, you can basically just stack a lot of crit damage and not have to worry about getting crit rate, particularly anyways. You just need crit damage hat. It's incredible. And then putting on top of that, on top of all these great, cheap options, because he uses defense as his primary stat, given the current evidence that artifacts are more prone to rolling defense and HP stats than any other stat, you can just dump all your defense artifacts onto him that I know you have lying around. Everyone probably has defense artifacts just in their inventory, because nobody uses defense except Noelle and Albedo. He also doesn't really need to have anything more than a 2-piece Archaic Petra set, because there isn't any defense boosting 5-star artifact set. So you just get 2 pieces of any Archaic Petra and slap the rest of it with just good defense gear. Boom, your Albedo is done. Now you could also run Defender's Will, but that's a 4-star artifact set, which makes it relatively easy to farm for still. But then you do lose out on an extra substat roll, and then you have a lower main stat value, so you might not want to do that. You might. It does give a 30% defense boost. It's up to you, but you don't need to. Basically, to get a fully functioning Albedo, you don't need to invest that much resin or even Mora. You could even inadvertently farm these artifacts while grinding out artifacts for Ningguang. There's still another problem though, or somewhat of a problem. Though I've stated that Zhongli is the best Geo support for Ningguang, This is mostly because Zhongli will just be that good of a support if his buffs go through. Realistically speaking, you don't need to limit Zhongli to just be Ningguang's support. At the same time, Albedo is also decent for any team, however, he's just decent. His Elemental Mastery on his passive 2 does help reaction teams, and it helps substantially, but if you're looking for someone who can actually boost Elemental Mastery, Sucrose, when she has 375 or more Elemental Mastery, will give the same or more Elemental Mastery than Albedo. And on top of that, she can even run the Viridescent Venerer set to shred enemy resistance. Now, if you want Albedo for his turret capabilities, he's still good, but if you have Fischl, she works almost just as well, and if you have her at C6, she's far better in terms of damage, though she still needs to use her burst in order to have 100% uptime, which Albedo has over her. Otherwise, Albedo is still good, just not as good as the best in those fields. A good generalist, if you will. And with that, we've reached a conclusion. If you're joining us from the description below, then welcome. If you scrolled here to this point in the video because you hate math but didn't want to scroll down to the description because you're too lazy to even do that, welcome! In conclusion, I believe Zhongli, should the buffs go through, to be the strongest Geo support for Ningguang when the 1.3 Geo Resonance changes are released. However, it is also my belief that if you have Zhongli and Albedo, you should use Albedo for Ningguang's team and Zhongli for your other team, simply because Zhongli would just be that useful. You would be able to put him in any team and that team's DPS will go up and potentially be unstoppable, since Zhongli's shield is the highest base shield in the entire game. Add on to the fact that he's a great burst damage support, he does everything! If you don't have both Zhongli and Albedo, because frankly, most people don't, I'm just a Geo junkie, I keep whichever of them you have with Ningguang because the Geo Resonance changes are too good to pass up, and also because the Traveler and Noelle are subpar as pure supports. Now, in reference to Noelle, you could run a dual DPS team with both Ningguang and Noelle, which would allow you to forego the whole battery comp most people build for Noelle. This way, you would be saving your Noelle for when things get kind of sticky. You could pop her skill and burst, heal off everything, and also kill everything, though this would require heavy investment into both Noelle and Ningguang, and you would also ideally want C1 Noelle or this won't work at all. This also isn't technically a support Noelle anymore, which is why this wasn't factored into her ranking and why she's at C tier and not like A tier or S tier in terms of Geo characters anyways. If you don't have Noelle or you don't want to have to pour in every last Mora and resin into her, you can use Traveler. I'm not saying you can't, but it's incredibly annoying. The boulders get in the way half the time, you can't see enemies the other half the time. When you want to go around the boulder, you'll end up climbing it. Enemies climb up it just because they can. It's overall a pain to work around, but it's doable, especially if you use the boulders only sparingly and mainly focus on just using their burst, which is why I rank Traveler higher than Noelle, because 10% crit rate is 10% crit rate. It's good. Again, let me reiterate this because a lot of people ignore that I say this, but play what you want to play. All of my videos are aimed at min-maxers or math-inclined people. If you don't particularly care about the math, then A, I don't know why you're watching this video, and B, okay. If you like playing Noelle pure support with Ningguang pure DPS, go for it. I don't care. I can't tell what you're doing unless you tell me you're doing it, and then I still won't care because you're having fun, I guess. If you're having fun, what does it matter to me? It's a game. But also, I do want to point out that just because you feel like your Noelle works better with Ningguang than your Traveler doesn't constitute as hard evidence that Noelle should be a higher rank. First off, as with any tier list, it's incredibly subjective. I try to be objective, and I try to look at all the variables, but I'm going to miss things, I'm going to misconstrue things, extrapolate information that can't be extrapolated, and my results would end up incorrect. If you think Noelle works better than Traveler, and you really need to get your opinion out there, go for it. Put a comment down below saying, you think Noelle is better than Traveler as a pure support. But it's far more helpful to me and the others in the community if you explain why you think so, and what evidence you have to back it up. Gut feelings are nice and all, but they aren't all that useful for theory crafting. If you say Noelle is better than Traveler, why? Is there some part of her kit that I missed? Is there some part of her attack sequence, her skill usage that is like, this is why she's better? If you don't have that, I can't really take your word for it, and neither can anyone else who's trying to do theory crafting. And yeah, that's about it. I hope this video helped all you current and aspiring Ningguang mains, or otherwise entertained you guys. This one was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but it was fun. Thanks for watching.